I have a confession to make. At the end of my videos, when I say, and here it is, all finished, and here it is, all finished, and here it is, all finished, and here it is, all finished. Sometimes it's not really all finished, and here it is, all finished, but it's finished enough to complete the video. But there are often some details that I didn't have time to get to. This desk is a good example. You may remember this desk from such videos as ebonizing a desk with vinegar and steel wool, and my last video from this house. I did a video on this desk in 2020. It's an oak desk, and I ebonized it with vinegar and steel wool, but there were a couple of big things that I didn't address before I finished the video. One is that it was missing drawer pulls for 2 of the drawers, and also the top. The top was a plastic laminate, and it looked okay for a laminate. It was in pretty good condition, but I always felt like the desk would look even better with a new top. So in this video, I'll put a new piece of wood veneer on the top and make a couple of drawer pulls. The first thing I did was to glue this piece of veneer to the laminate top. I found a big roll of this veneer at a thrift store for a pretty cheap price. I'm not positive, but I think it's white oak. And it's a paper-backed veneer, but I'm not sure what the thickness is. One thing that can be an issue sometimes with veneer is it can be a little bit rippled or bumpy. You can kind of see here where there are some raised portions of the veneer. So you have to be really careful to get those parts glued down. I think there's even some kind of a veneer flattener that you can get that you apply to the veneer to flatten it out. I've never tried that, but it may be worth a try. Before I glued the veneer on, I sanded down the top to get rid of the gloss, just to help the glue to adhere easier. And I did this with 80 grit sandpaper. And then I vacuumed it off. And wiped it down with some naphtha. There may be better ways to do this than what I'm showing in this video, but this technique has worked for me on a few pieces, so I'll just show how I did it. And then I applied some contact cement, and you have to apply the cement to both surfaces because it will only stick to itself. I applied 2 coats to the veneer since that's an absorbative surface, so it may absorb some of the first application of glue that you put on. So once that's dry, I just put another coat over that, and I put a coat of glue on the top. And then you're supposed to wait for it to dry a little bit. And before I laid the veneer over the top, I put some dowels on the desktop just to keep the veneer and the desktop from touching until I'm ready for them to touch. Because the way contact cement works, once the 2 surfaces touch, they're not going to come apart again. So having the dowels there gives you a chance to get the veneer aligned properly before sticking it to the top. And then I took the dowels out one by one and pressed the 2 surfaces together. And I used my fingers and also the end of this chisel to really focus on getting all of those ripples pushed down and stuck to the desktop. And then I went over the top with a piece of wood with one edge rounded off. And I'm sure I'll get lots of comments from people saying I should be using a J roller for this. And I'm sure that would also work. But I got this technique from a veneer manufacturer that recommended this instead of a J roller. And since I don't have a J roller, but I have plenty of scrap wood lying around, I've been using this technique, and it's worked well for me. And you want to make sure you apply plenty of pressure to get those two surfaces stuck together. Once the veneer was glued down, then I had to remove the excess around the edges. And I used a router with a flush cutting bit on it. This is a bit that has a bearing that rides along the edge, so it just follows the edge and cuts the veneer flush with the side of the desktop. Or at least that's what it's supposed to do. In this case, the edge of the desktop was curved, so the bearing was riding along the high edge of the curve, so the blade couldn't reach all the way to the edge of the top. So there was just a little bit of veneer left over, sticking over the edge. So to take care of that, I took a utility knife blade and just carefully trimmed the excess off. And then I sanded the edge smooth. The next thing I did was to wet down the surface with water. I did this because I knew I was going to be applying some vinegar and steel wool later on to turn it black. And putting vinegar on that could possibly raise the grain of the wood, and then I'd have to sand it. And I don't know how far down the black color goes, so I didn't want to end up sanding through the black. So by first putting water on the veneer, the water will raise the grain, which I can then sand smooth. And then when I put the vinegar on, hopefully that won't raise the grain very much, since I already did that with the water. And then I just let the top sit for a few days to give the glue plenty of time to set. And in the meantime, I moved on to making some drawer pulls. I made the drawer pulls from an old piece of tongue and groove oak flooring. First thing I did was to cut off the tongue and the groove. And then just made a series of cuts to get the piece down to the size that I wanted. Then I angled the blade a little bit to put a little bit of a taper on it. And then cut them to length. The drawers already had screw holes drilled in them from the original pulls, which were gone when I got the desk. So I used those holes to get the overall length of the pull. Only 2 of the drawers needed pulls. The others you could open by just grabbing underneath the front of the drawer. Then I could drill the screw holes on a drill press. And I rounded off the ends using a belt sander. And then I could apply the vinegar and steel wool mixture to the top and the drawer pulls. But before I applied the vinegar, I first went over the veneer on the top with a wire brush to clean out the pores of the wood. This oak had some pretty deep pores, and I really wanted them to stand out when it was finished. I wanted them to be visible. So I cleaned them out as best I could with the brush. And then I could apply the vinegar. If you'd like to know more about how I made this, take a look at my previous video where I ebonized a bench, or the original video for this desk from back in 2020 where I ebonized the bottom of the desk. But the short answer is I made it by putting a pad of steel wool into a bottle of vinegar and letting it dissolve. And when it's applied to a wood like oak, it reacts with the tannin in the wood and turns it black. Although it doesn't turn it completely black, which is nice, it actually gives it a very natural look. And there's some variation in the color, and there may be some light streaks and dark streaks, but not a blotchy look, just kind of a very natural look to it. The edge of the desktop was a little bit beat up, so I went over that with some black wood filler to try to fill in some of those divots and make it a little smoother looking. And then I went over the whole edge with some black paint. And I didn't get footage of that, so instead I'll show this footage from the original desk video from 2020 when I first painted this edge. Before I applied the top coat, I first wiped down the top and the pulls with some naphtha, and I did this just to clean off any excess black stuff that was on there, and it did take some off the surface. It just seemed like a good idea to remove anything loose, and it didn't seem to affect the overall color of the desk. And I didn't have to use naphtha for this. I just used it because it was the closest thing at hand. I could have used anything that wouldn't raise the grain. This just happened to be nearby. Once the vinegar was dry, then I applied a top coat of satin clear lacquer to the top and the drawer pulls. I also ended up going over the entire desk with the lacquer. When I first finished this desk in the first video, I used a top coat of water-based polyacrylic, and I didn't have a lot of experience with that, and actually I still don't. And I had brushed it on, and there were some bubbles in the finish that dried and left a little bit of a bumpy feel in some spots. And I just wasn't entirely happy with the look. So I gave it a light sanding with some 320 paper and went over it with some clear lacquer to freshen it up. After I applied a few coats of lacquer and let it dry, I gave it a light sanding with this fine sanding pad. It doesn't have a grit number on it, but it feels like it's probably around 320. Just gently to get off any rough spots in the lacquer. And then I applied a few more coats. The last thing to do was to screw on the drawer pulls. And here it is. Thanks for watching.